today. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to go over, most of the policies are in the 4300 section. Most of these are just simple revisions. So it shouldn't take us long to run through these. I'll turn it over to Mr. Gentry now.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. And it does appear from table of contents with the policies listed, ones that are subject to revision, that there is a small number of those. And I do have a question, though, and I'm referring to, I'm on 4325, 1 of 3, drugs and alcohol. And I think we all know that CBD has been legalized for medicinal purposes, and that medication, like any other medication, is subject to the same monitoring and restrictions, including being in the possession of the designated school official. And that is not all spelled out in this policy, but some of the specifics will be, or I'm hoping, I'm not assuming, they will be in the handbook. The handbooks are revised every year. But I just wanted to note that. And so moving forward from that, unless anyone has any remarks or questions about that, that, like any other controlled substance, of course, does deserve proper monitoring and restrictions, and not be left in the hands of the student.
I do move that we approve 4325, Mr. Chairman, the revised section of it. And should a team see something that needs to be added, that we come back and add it later.
Okay.
You second my motion since you and
I second it. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
And Mr. Gentry, just to add, I'm sorry, if you look on page 2 or 3, there are 2 statements there that make reference to a student using this as long as it, as part of a prescription. 4 talks about student, or sharing their prescription drugs, and 5 makes reference to that students are not in violation of this policy if it is medication.
Correct.
And whenever we look at these revised laws, there's always subdivisions of the law that's added on the pages that you can look at also.
Right. Yeah, there is a repetition and enhancement.
Well, it's always when the arguments are done, they include those in here to state why and how they derive with it.
Right.
Like Mr. Barber said.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay, if there are no further remarks or questions, we'll move on to 43, Policy Code 4328, page 1 of 3. And there is a definition of gang there in that first paragraph. And I'm glad that the words whether formal or informal are included in the definition, because they're not always apparent. You know, we in spite of all of the gang-related training that we have, and I know we do have it every year on an ongoing basis, and I think it needs to even be out through the year, because it bears updating even through the course of the year. But sometimes it's very subtle, and if we're not on top of our game, things can slip by us. And it's important to be able to pick up on any actions or words or symbols or signs, whatever you want to call them, to be aware of and to nip it in the bud, as Barney used to say.
Approval 4328, Mr. Chairman. North Carolina School Board Association will be updated on every language that's changed by our legislation.
Okay. Are you citing 40 on page 2 or 3?
Yeah, 4328 gang related. I move approval of that.
Okay. Okay, I see that. Then the last paragraph?
Actually, I love to move approval for all these revised because I've read them already.
Yes. Okay, well, we can, we can
And
certainly,
you can just say what it is, and I'm gonna come
Yeah.
read it.
I do like the language change though from harassment, that it's time consuming to prove that, because there has to be a clearly defined pattern of behavior. And where they've added threat, that's clear, to the point. And so I do like that language change. I think that's better for us.
Now, one of the things, Chairman, if I may, one of the things, Dr. Williams said the handbooks at school, some of them that I did look at, some of them don't have the same thing that we actually have, but they, discipline the students according to what it is for that. Now, to me, when it comes to the law is the law. And I think that's how all the handbooks should have it.
One of the things that we're gonna do down the road is a district code, student code of
Okay.
conduct that'll address just what you said.
Okay.
And school handbooks will align to that.
Okay.
It is our policy in the law that requires that. Yes,
And this way, all school students will be treated the same.
right.
And to add to that, and through the work of student services, there's currently a revision being made to our student code of conduct book. I think Mr. Dale and Mr. Phillips working on that, from my understanding.
Good point.
it makes reference to that, I think, Mr. Bobby, in the second paragraph, 4328, page 2 of 2, student code of conduct, code of student conduct and all student handbooks or other similar materials distributed to parents and students in lieu of the student handbook shall contain notice, and it goes on to list the various elements that are related to gang activity. And as Dr. Williamson pointed out, harassment falls under that umbrella as well. And again, some of these gangs have gotten quite sophisticated and are able to carry on activities undetected in some cases. And we need to be mindful of that on top of that. If we're ready to move on from that, 4333, page 1 of 6.
I move approval of that too, the revised.
Okay, okay, I'm sorry. All right, thank you for that. Is there a second?
You have to second, Mr. Baker.
Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All right, I have a question related to, it lists, of course, all the different types of weapons and materials that are prohibited. And BB guns, I'm specifically referring to those because there's a redundant referral to BB guns and air rifles and air pistols. Those are among the prohibited items in this list. However, and I'll ask you to move over to page 3 of 6. Any student who becomes aware that another student or others intends to use a device, substance, or material designed to cause harmful illness or injury to another person, makes a terrorist threat, or perpetuates a terrorist hoax, must notify a teacher. That was really not the one. Oh, here, the one I'm looking for. I'm sorry. It's on 5 of 6. And then I'm looking at the third paragraph when it, I'm talking about number 3. A firearm does not include an inoperable antique firearm, BB gun, stun gun, an air rifle, or an air pistol. My interpretation has always been, and I don't think I belong in this, I know I'm not, because the semblance or the appearance of potential violence by handling any type of gun can bring on, a weapon can bring on a negative consequence because of the fear that it engenders. Whether it's loaded, whether it's real, you can't bring a toy gun to school and flash it around or point it at somebody. And this seems to contradict that. Anybody speak to that?
Historically, I've always operated, if it was gas powered, that's what separated. That's what was a regular manual BB gun. Then, because I was kind of surprised when I saw BB gun as a weapon too. But if it's a manual BB gun, I think the definition is still the same, that it's not. If it's a gas powered BB gun or gas powered something, then it falls under that weapons definition. That's, I've always distinguished the difference. And it uses that language of being able to propel something in the gas powered in the policy.
And to add to that, under that section you're referring to, Mr. Gentry, is about the consequence. So the handgun itself would warrant the 365, whereas a BB gun would not. I think that's what separates the language there.
But nevertheless,
I'm like Mr. Gentry, I think we need to look at, I have a BB gun, and it's so powerful. If I shoot from here to the back of there, it's gonna break that window pane out.
Is it gas powered?
I don't know what kind it is, I know it's a lot of power. But I think BB guns need to be included. It's an argument that a lot of legal people talk to them about because, you can't, the way the guns are made now, BB guns and things, you can't tell the difference in them and a real one. So to me,
Right.
for the sake of safety, I think it should be no gun. BB guns are not,
well, even antique guns.
well, that's why I said.
Case in point, I remember this vividly. I was not there, school in another district. A student brought a weapon from the Civil War to show it off, and it exploded in the classroom. And I can't remember if someone was killed or if they were severely injured. But what I'm saying is the pretense, whether it's not loaded, whether it's real, not real, whether it's antique or modern, across the board. You know, somebody sees a BB gun, they don't know that it's a BB gun, and they run down the hall and run through a glass door. You know, the fear caused by it is just as destructive as the weapon itself.
We was
in a lot of
working in
cases.
Ramsey County last year when Hurricane Isaias and our group, the Civil Air Patrol, and I was team leader. One of the things that we thought was they were pulling a gun out on us, we found out later, we took them down, okay? Then when the colonel came up, he said, stand down, and of course, y'all know we did. We found out it was a BB gun, but he was about to get shot
Yeah,
because we did not know it was a BB gun.
right.
You can't tell. Years ago, you could tell the difference, now you can't
Right.
because of the climate. I'm speaking because of the climate that we're living in now. I think BB guns should not be prohibited either.
Well, you see gun, period. And your vision is distorted at that time because you're nervous and scared. Somebody's got a gun.
Now, I'm not a principal
Regardless
now,
of what
okay?
kind it is.
I'm not a principal, I don't work on the campus. I'm just speaking from the legal standpoint. I am a former law enforcement officer. To God be the glory, former, not now. But I still step on my critics. And I do know the climate is now, once our law enforcement officers, they're gonna protect themselves.
Yeah, I think our practice has to be, the language stays to include BB guns. And then as Bobby stated, we distinguish in the consequences. And then we look at if it's gas powered or that facsimile of a gun and the starter, you know, to look for the orange plug, all those kinds of things. But I think we leave that language in. Our intent is not to have a weapon
Right.
or
Or semblance of
or
one.
semblance of one, if it's tied to a history, social studies lesson, then there are procedures in place to clear that weapon to be on campus, right?
Yes, sir.
Robert, right. So following policy will help us, but I agree, leave the language there because it's
Yeah, leave
hard
it
to distinguish. If your BB gun will travel
It's
that far,
nice.
then that's a weapon.
I agree, and I meant for it to hit him, okay?
Right.
Gun.
I agree.
Right.
But I got a BB gun because when I was shot in my house with a gun, I didn't want to shoot nobody to kill him. So I got the BB gun.
And since,
Can we tailor that language to fit that? I like that, Dr. Williams's last comment.
but we
Make
also,
it clear.
since it's part of the Gun Free Schools Act, that's what I was asking Bob. I mean, we can't change it, can we, if it's part of the,
We can't change it, but you can add to.
right, that's what I'm
You can
saying,
add
so
to.
we can't, you know.
Well, like you said, if it's brought, and the proper procedures are followed as an exhibit or an artifact, that's one thing. But just to have it there,
Get together and,
I like how Superintendent said,
with the language.
because still the principal has, and that's speaking to how the child is suspended. I understand that. That's what that's speaking to. Because everything else is gonna fall into the hands of SRO.
right,
And then I've got it noted here that we'll ask the school board if we can adjust the language to include the other language that we have back on starting on page 1. We make reference to the BB guns and the air rifles and such.
good, I feel better about that now. Okay, any other questions, comments? If not, we'll move on to, policy code 4345, page 1 of 2. That's fairly straightforward. I do have a question, and I'm thinking back to my days as an administrator. Is there a clear policy about how many 10-day suspensions constitute a basis for long-term? And I realize it doesn't even have to be, if it's a serious offense, it doesn't have to be a 10-day suspension. Is there any reference or any clarification of that about, let's say during the course of the year, a student has 3 10-day suspensions? I didn't see anything that speaks to that.
No, but for some reason, the number for short terms, and that's what we talk, 10 or less days, seemed like
Right.
there were 15 days tied to that. Help me to remember, I would have to look that up. But short-term suspension max was 15 days. And so, well, we've always said to principals or APs, don't max your 15 days on one, kind of spread it out so that you get you through. And I'm not sure, but for some reason, 15 is the number that pops. Somebody may know the answer to that.
And I know some of our high school principals use as a rule of thumb, like if a kid has 2 fights, then that would automatically trigger a long-term suspension because it's 2 of the same behavior. But let's say one suspension for disrespect and another for fighting may not trigger that long-term suspension because it's 2 different behaviors.
Yeah, I recall that too. Is that in our policy now, in our own policy?
I got a note to check on it, I can't
I do recall that, Bobby. Yeah,
check.
yeah.
I don't think there's, I'm gonna go back, you're saying like the 10-day suspensions,
Yeah.
or above that, the long term. Is there a certain number that they could be given each year, or how many times could it be done? I mean, make sure I understand.
Yeah, in other words, is there a number limit according to the number of days? I've heard Dr. Williams said he thinks it's 15. Okay, if they've got 15 days of short-term suspensions, then they are subject to, not necessarily done deal, to long-term suspension. Seemed like I remember something about that way back.
If there is any. I know I've operated in the past under the 15 days. Once you use those short-term days, then it wasn't automatic referral to the alternative school or the alternative learning program. But I don't know that that's in print.
I don't know that there's anything that we've ever had in print about doing that. And I don't know that I ever remember seeing anything.
But I think the overall language
Handbook, I know that.
speaks to that, in that there are other measures that can be taken, alternative school being one of them. But, you know, elsewhere, there's material about the cumulative record, and, you know, it's looking at the students' actions in context of what's happened before. There needs to be, and there is, according to what's told to us here, and long-term being an option, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a done deal. Alternative school could be another one.
But it need to be uniform because a grievance that we had years ago, Lumberton Senior suspended a child 10 days. The child from Pernet Sweat got long-term suspension. So all the high schools need to be uniform. It used to did say, when it came before us, they said 15 days at a time. It wasn't uniform across the county.
That's a very good point.
And I think that goes back to our student code of conduct, having that book in place.
Right.
And it's about what was said too about the fights at the high school, that, and I found out about that the other year, that, you know, 2 fights at a high school, they were long-term suspended. But I think from what I could understand, that's more or less was an understanding. I don't know if it was ever put in any policy, and there's been a few situations where all you need is one high school not following it,
That's right.
and it creates a problem. And there's been a few times where that has happened.
Different high schools
so-
operate differently.
I ain't gonna say I disagree with it, but it definitely needs to be looked at to make sure we are consistent with how that is handled. Because you're talking about a kid that's a senior. That, and I can go through these situations, the kid that's a senior, and something comes up and happens in February or March, and they're gone. And basically, I'm gonna take this kid that's never really been in trouble, and somebody comes up, pops them side of the face. They retaliate, and then we go from there. And of course, you know, we can sit here and discuss those situations forever, but we need to make sure we got something and we're consistent on that countywide.
Great. And then, Jennifer, help us. From the state, the real issue is now that short-term, long-term should not have a negative impact on students because of one-to-one. We can keep them connected to the teaching and learning that doesn't have that negative impact, even the expulsion, if we chose to do that. And so we have that capacity now, correct?
Yes, that's correct, Dr. Williamson. That's what Wendy and I were just briefly chatting about back here, because that is not, should not have a negative impact on the students at this time. We also had we also were talking about the code of conduct as it relates to our department in terms of the services we deliver. We deliver services that are not punitive in our department because we oversee student services. So we need to revisit that code of conduct and have some conversation, especially since the counselors and all of those folks reside in our department. It could be considered a conflict of interest.
And we've started a conversation around lab, to change that from an alternative learning program to designate that as an alternative school, so that when we reassign students there, one, we'll be able to draw the ADM, you know, all those technical is part of that, but they're on that work in those scores. So we're thinking about that conversation at this point, to have that as a designated school.
Move for approval, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
Second.
I'll second it. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. All right. Actually, that whole, we're in the last, section, and that brings us to the discussion of long-term versus expulsion, I do have a question about, I know that gives a definition of expulsion. And of course, long-term suspension, 365. And get, Mr. Craig, what you said brings me to, there is some clarification about what constitutes long-term, depending on when it occurs, whether it occurs in the last quarter of the year. There's some language in here that addresses that, what's considered long-term, and, you know, it may actually not be 365, depending on what time of the year it occurs. That's the way I understood it. Is that right, Dr. Williams?
Yeah, I mean, I think we normally operated on the short term, 10 or less, long term, 10 or more. 365 as defined by basically weapons. The 365 suspension at the end of that time automatically returns the student back to the building where and even with a 365, parents can petition to shorten that time, that we can make a decision for that. The expulsion is you do not have to provide that option for a student to return to the building. And so historically, I've always stayed away from the expulsion part of that part. But that's, I'm not sure what would determine that we ought to expel a student. I've seen some things in the past that certainly, in my mind, do not meet the definition that we need to do that and take away that option. There's some federal issues now, Jennifer, around expulsion. You don't see it as much because it can impact your federal funding, because you're denying students the right for an education with that.
Yes, sir, we have to be very mindful in federal programs. That's why I was sharing previously with the team about where we reside in the world of student services. But yes, it could actually impact, and we could actually lose or freeze federal funding because of the rights of students and equity of learning.
And getting back to the offer of continuing services. If we don't do that, we're setting that student up and our community up for further activity, which could be on a criminal. It could be negative, and it could be criminal. Now, that was the thing that always, you know, I'm thinking about Craig. Craig and I worked together for a number of years, but we always tried to be mindful of the fact, hey, this student is going to be out and about. He's not necessarily going to be sitting at home. And there are any number of things he could get into, or she, while they're on suspension. And if their expulsion is, hey, man, there's no point in me even trying to do anything. I'm not going to be able to come back to school. And so they get into some stuff. It can be very negative.
Agree?
Anyway,
Have it all, Mr. Bobby? Have we concluded?
I think
That's
we're
it.
Move
at the
adjournment,
end
Mr. Chairman.
here.
Yeah, that was it, just,
If there's no other questions, move adjournment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
we'll have these ready for the next board meeting. Because we won't need 2 readings for these, since these are just revisions.
That's my interpretation. We'll ask the chairman to place it on the agenda for voting. Right?
You have it then.
Okay. There's been a motion to adjourn. No one cares to second. I'll second it. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Very much.
You.
And we'll-